The early summer of 1980, a man named James Kay went fishing on the St. Croix River in Wisconsin, not far from the Minnesota border. He floated in on a canoe and found a suitable spot to set up a camp for that night on a sandbar which set on one side of the river and backed up to the bank, which was thick with forest. It was why he had chose to canoe in. The surrounding forest was too thick to think about trying to walk in to the spot he had in mind. Most times James would have been fishing with his father, but the old fellow passed away that previous winter at the age of 82. James had plenty of time to arrange another fishing partner, which he should have done, but in the end he let his vacation time slip up on him, and he was faced with going fishing alone or staying home. He decided to honor the old man by going fishing. He packed up the necessities and drove the 3-hour drive to the spot where he put the canoe into the water. James dragged 2 coolers along. Both were heavy with ice, while one was stocked with a couple of steaks, potatoes for baking, and some candy bars for snacking in between meals. The second cooler was nothing but liquid refreshments. Some of it was Gatorade, and the rest was beer. He also had a section which was for bait. During the daylight hours he would be cast fishing, but the night was for catfish, which didn't involve near as much attention on his part, but did require some sort of either live bait or something that had been alive at one time. This particular outing he brought chicken livers. They were about as good a bait as any for catfish. If his father had been with him, they would have set some trout lines, which would have required some live bait, preferably, but James wasn't that dedicated this trip. He planned on mostly getting drunk and remembering time with the old man. First he had to get his camp set up now that he had arrived at the sandbar. The tent wasn't much, since most of the nights he and his dad had just sat up in their chairs and drank until they fell asleep. Generally one of them would get a bite, causing them to wake up, or on the rare nights they didn't get any attention, they would simply sleep it off in their chairs, and often waking up long enough after the sun had made an appearance. James took little time getting his camp set up. Fixing his supper was another story. He started his fire and let things get cooked down to where he had some nice hot coals to work with, and then he proceeded to toss a couple of potatoes wrapped in foil into the hot coals. Then he located a steak out of the food cooler and tossed it on the mobile grill he had brought with him. By the time the sun was teasing the western horizon, the food was well on its way to cooking, and James enjoyed a couple of beers. He didn't get to watch the sun set because the sandbar was far below the level of the riverbank at that location. The sun coming in from the east would not have the same trouble finding him. James enjoyed his dinner and eventually got his fishing poles into the water baited with chicken liver. 2 more beers later, and he was sitting in complete darkness with the exception of the light put off by his campfire. He had a flashlight with him, but the fire was providing sufficient illumination to be able to see his poles. They were both right in front of his chair, one thrown out one direction, while the same was true with the other, going the other direction. James clicked open another beer and took notice of a foul odor all of a sudden. He turned on his flashlight and aimed the beam upwind to see if he could see anything, but nothing looked out of place. The wind was blowing in from the west, and the river was turning to flow south for a small stretch right where he was at, so whatever it was that stunk was not something that had arrived by floating down from upstream. No, whatever it was that stunk was doing so from somewhere back in the brush-saturated forest that waited beyond the turn of the river. James tried to ignore the foul odor by increasing the rate of beers he was downing per hour. An hour or more later, James had become certain that the foul odor was growing more intense. He didn't know how that was possible, since that wind had not picked up. The stench was that of something dead. What sort of thing is it that's dead that gets closer to you? James was starting to consider floating on further down the river when one of his fishing poles suddenly bent over like it had been shot at and was ducking to avoid the bullets. The pole bent over and then bounced several times to drive the point home that there was maybe a fish on the line. James jumped up, spilling his beer down his leg. He cursed colorfully and then grabbed the pole, which was still bent over like it had encountered a severe bellyache. He lifted the pole and gave it a yank to set the hook. He felt the refusal of something with some weight and power to it. James had the line near its conclusion when the second fishing pole violently bent over and bounced its end like it was pointing out the guilty party in a criminal trial. He set the pole he had been holding down in the pole holder while the fish was still on the line. Next he grabbed up the other pole that had just bent over so he could again set the hook and begin pulling in his catch. The second pole definitely had the bigger fish on it, but that didn't mean it was the fish James wanted the most. Bigger catfish often are not as good as one which is pan size or slightly bigger. However, he had to consider which line was likely to be broken if it was not shown attention. In the end, he opted to pull in the larger fish first. Once he got it up onto the sandbar, he could see it was a fine-sized fish of about 3.5 feet in length. He thought maybe 10 or 12 pounds. James didn't bother to get the hook out of the bigger fish. Instead, he threw down the pole and grabbed up the other line, the first one he had put back on the pole holder. He let his hand become comfortable with the controls and then began to reel it in. The pole bent over, resisting his demand, and in the end the fish was unable to find something it could get the line caught on, and as a result the channel catfish was brought in to exhaustion, and then it was easily brought into the shore where James was able to grab it up. He followed the light from his flashlight back to where he had thrown down the pole and discovered the other fish was gone. At first he thought the fish must have found a way to get itself back into the river. It seemed unlikely, but what other explanation could there be? Looking at the end of the fishing pole, he saw the line was broke. That was really odd. It wasn't impossible that a catfish could bite its way through a fishing line, although it seemed extremely unlikely. Still, that had to be it. He turned his attention back to his other pole and pulled the catfish off the hook. He quickly baited the hook and threw the line back out into the water and put the pole in the pole holder. He went back over to the other pole and grabbed it up and began to tie another hook on the line. Then he baited that line and threw it back out into the water. Damn, that cinch must be blowing directly my direction. The terrible cinch he had earlier noticed was not getting any better. In fact, it seemed to have gotten much stronger. James was glad he had downed a few beers to help him endure this horrible stench. It had gotten stronger, which meant he must have been wrong about where it was originally located. The dead-smelling thing must have been upstream and was in the process of passing his location at that very moment, or very soon, because he couldn't imagine it getting much worse. Normally, he would not choose to be anywhere near the catfish he was pulling out of the river, because they did not smell wonderful. But this night, he was actually looking forward to being near the catfish that he had unhooked from his pole and left sitting on the sandbar. He flashed his light around and didn't see it. This was crazy. Having one fish break a line and then find its way back to the edge of the water was one thing. It was very unlikely, but okay, it happened, so it must be possible. But to have two catfish find their way back into the water without him ever hearing a splash was asking him to believe a lot. It meant those fish had somehow covered about 15 paces, some of which was slightly uphill, in order to get back into the water. Geez, that odor was enough. He decided to screw this spot. All that was going wrong combined with that horrible stench was enough to force him to go elsewhere. The problem was that he hadn't seen a better place coming downstream to where he was at, so he would need to go further downstream. Doing so meant he might have to endure this entire scenario of the dead stench catching up with him again. He would have to go through the whole thing again. James was really torn. How much longer would that stench stay around? Just then he heard one of the poles start giving out line, something that was running with his bait. He quickly gave up all his current thoughts and went into fish-on mode. Generally, that involved him spilling his drink or beer while trying to get to his pole as fast as possible, which may or may not involve a face-first visit to the sandbar, mostly dependent upon the number of beers ingested. When it rains, it pours. The second pole began to sing as something was also taking that line for a long stroll. James focused on the pole he had in hand. If you hear the line start singing out of the reel, you don't have to worry about setting the hook. If it hasn't already been done, then it will be quick enough, without your help. As such, James concentrated on bringing in the channel catfish he had on the pole in his hand. He brought it up on the sandbar and left the pole there with the fish. Then he raced over to the other fishing pole and took it out of the holder. When he was finished, he had another nice channel catfish. He brought it up onto the sandbar to where he had set down the first catfish, but he didn't see it anywhere. He shined his flashlight beam all around but didn't see the fish. He let go a sigh of frustration and grabbed up the one catfish he still had and removed the hook from its mouth. And then he dropped the fish down right next to his feet and kept a foot on top of it while baiting the empty hook again. Next, he grabbed the other fishing pole and again tied another hook on the line, as it had once again been broke. He baited the new hook and took the catfish he had at his feet with him, the 10 or so paces over to where his pole holders were set in the sandbar. He dropped the catfish so he could keep a foot on it and then proceeded to cast his lines back out into the water. While the lines were still fresh in the water, he decided to go ahead and clean the channel catfish he had underfoot. This one wasn't getting away. James picked the 3-foot-long fish up by the tail and proceeded to slap its head against the nearby rock. He did it 2 or 3 more times, and then he used his knife to slice the skin behind the fish's head. Then he grabbed some multi-pliers he bought from Gerber and proceeded to rip away all the skin off the fish. Next, he broke the head away from the neck and pulled it down toward the fish's anus. It caused the stomach to rip out and take most of the inner organs with it. James threw the head and stomach, which were all basically attached, over away from his location, but still up on the sandbar. Then he cleaned the meat in the water and stuck it into his drinks cooler. Still, that stench remained, but the fish were biting. The whole scenario just told basically played out again. There was one difference. James kept his foot on the fish he was handling and then cleaning. And after each fish were separated, their heads and stomachs from the rest of it, he would throw the unwanted parts way up on the other end of the sandbar where he didn't have to worry about stepping in them or smelling them. That is, if that current stench ever passed. If he had paid any sort of real attention, he would have noticed just above the edge of the riverbank 2 sets of amber-colored eyes were watching him. If that horrible odor didn't pass, he was sure not going to be hungry again the entire time he was out fishing. Of course, he wasn't going to endure such a scenario. He had made up his mind when morning came, if it still stunk, he was getting out of there. As things were going, he was catching enough to justify leaving the next day and going home, if he should decide he wanted it. Several more times through the night, James caught some nice-sized catfish, and he again followed the protocol of keeping a foot on the one he was not handling and then throwing the unwanted parts away from his location. He knew the raccoons would quickly find the parts of the fish he was throwing away, and they would eat it happily. As the morning grew old and the darkness gave way to the sun peeking over the east horizon, James heard the last of the critters which had come in the darkest, most lonely hours of the night to get a free meal. They disappeared up into the thick forest on the bank back behind him. The stench had not retreated nor lost its strength. If what was dead had passed on down the river, it must have left a representative behind, because memories didn't make a person want to gag. He never let his gaze rise up to the riverbank, or he might have seen eyes looking back down at him. James made up his mind he was just going to have to take the hint and move on. He had a nice bounty of channel catfish, enough in fact to merit not needing to go further downstream and risk running into whatever was stinking everything up. He planned on just getting in his canoe and paddling back to his car and calling it a successful weekend wrapped up by Saturday afternoon. He left his fishing poles baited and in the water, planning on taking them out as the last effort before leaving. Just as he was getting ready to reel in the first pole, he saw it bend over, so he grabbed the pole and freed it from the holder. Next, he set the hook, and 5 minutes later, he was pulling in another nice-sized cat. He quickly cleaned it, and this time, instead of throwing the unwanted parts in the general direction away from where he was at, he instead walked it over to see what kind of a mess the raccoons had made of the other unwanted parts he threw over that way. James got about 5 steps in that direction when he stopped suddenly. The hair on the back of his neck and his arms went standing straight up. He got that horrible gut-deep feeling that very soon he was going to regret being where he was at. A rush of fear, terror, and yes, embarrassment rushed through his body the way a shiver does. A twitch of knowledge which you had been ignorant suddenly owned your body, leaving only the ability of awareness of surroundings and the capability to feel pain. The world felt like it was spinning around, laughing wholeheartedly at your ignorant, foolish, which surely has never been in such a huge portion ever before, and likely never again. It is the feeling of finding out your prom date had been pulling a train while you were out getting that brand of 3.2 beer she just had to have. Finding out it was your brother that wrecked your dirt bike and left it in a pile of unrecognizable steel. It was finding out that that noise you had heard and thought were cute little raccoons helping themselves to the heads and guts of your catfish had actually been the sound of something which had paws nearly twice the size of your feet. The tracks were everywhere, too. James looked all around, so scared he had to force himself to do the looking. Being ignorant of what may harm you is no kind of a defense at all. If you know you're in trouble, you need to suck it up and force yourself to find out just how bad things are. James had to force himself to stay in the present. His mind wanted desperately to replay the night and find the exact moment he had missed the fact that huge Bigfoot creatures were just feet away from him apparently the entire night, and he hadn't been wise to the fact. Aside from the horrifying fact he had just discovered, and he was terrified, he was also hugely embarrassed. He could feel his face flush with the blood. How could he have been such a douche? Creatures? Big enough to kill him with the slightest of ease. Just literally feet away from his dumbass flesh and bones as he ignorantly cleaned those fish and then nonchalantly tossed their remains over in the direction of what must have been huge beasts, just watching him act like the biggest doofus in the world. It was almost unbearable to consider. Still, there was time to beat himself up later. He had a feeling he might be lucky to live to beat himself up for his stupidness. The first thing he did was to toss the remains of the fish over in the same direction, acting like he hadn't seen anything to be upset about. Lucky he had already loaded up everything into the canoe with the exception of his fishing poles. Lucky because now he felt eyes on him. He almost felt compelled to turn and look, but for the first time in his life, he concluded he was better off not looking. He kept his eyes on the canoe and he went straight for it, stopping only to bend over and grab the fish he had just cleaned to pick it up as a reason for walking over to the canoe. And he put the meat into the drinks cooler. And then he slid the canoe right out into the water, leaving the fishing poles behind. James began to paddle upstream as hard as he could go. In a couple hours, he would be loading his canoe in coolers and going home. Once he was far enough away, he gave a glance back at the sandbar. There, not standing where he had thrown the remains of the catfish, was something bent over. It had black fur or hair, ears like a German shepherd, and the last thing he saw of the creature, it had stood up on its back legs, and it was towering. Even from that distance, James could easily see the beast was much taller than he was, but of course he couldn't offer a better guess than to say it was probably at least a head taller and was much, much wider. It still had its back to him, so all he could see was, from that angle, the shoulders were extremely wide, and the waist was narrow as the shoulders were wide. The arms looked muscular, and they had appeared to end with hands or something like hands that had long black claws. The back legs, or the legs it was standing on, were weird in the way that they curved backwards, like they were the back legs of a dog or a wolf. The creature never turned around so he could see its face, and he never saw directly into its merciless eyes, but he will always remember the feeling of having them watching him. James felt more motivation than ever to get his canoe paddled upstream. He wanted nothing more than to leave that area behind. James has never returned to the area where he saw the huge werewolf-looking creature that he first thought might be Sasquatch. He feels, though he saw just one, that based on the tracks he briefly saw, that it was likely there were more than one. He also says whenever he talks about it that inevitably he will have some nightmares where the canoe is unable to overtake the current and he is forced back to the creature which waits for him on the sandbar. Thank you for visiting. Please like and subscribe. It is greatly appreciated. Godspeed to all.